I never expected that a plumbing disaster would change my life, but that's exactly what happened when my upstairs apartment decided to flood the one below it. It's funny, isn't it? How a series of mundane, unfortunate events, a rusted pipe, a weak seal, a bit too much water pressure, can conspire to completely rewrite your future. For me, it was less about the water damage and more about the man who lived downstairs. The man whose ceiling I had inadvertently turned into a rain cloud. My name is Miles. At the time, I was 26, working a quiet life from home as a web developer. My world was mostly contained within the four walls of my apartment, a predictable cycle of code, coffee, and takeout. It wasn't a bad life, just a small one. My routine was my armor, a way to keep the quiet loneliness that sometimes buzzed at the edges of my consciousness at bay. I was content, or so I told myself. I was safe. The building was one of those old brick walk-ups with good bones and a history you could feel in the creak of the floorboards. It had character, which was a nice way of saying it was constantly in need of minor repairs. My apartment was on the third floor, a cozy space with a view of a maple tree that turned a brilliant, fiery orange in the fall. It was my sanctuary. And then there was Caleb, the man in 2B, my downstairs neighbor. He was a firefighter, and he fit the image so perfectly it was almost a cliché. He was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed custom-built to carry the weight of the world, or at least an oxygen tank and a fire hose. I knew this because I'd seen him coming home from a shift, his face smudged with soot but his smile, when he offered a quick one to our elderly neighbor Mrs. Gable, tired but genuine. From my window, I had a perfect vantage point of the building's small parking lot. I'd watch him leave in his beat-up pickup truck, a thermos of coffee in his hand. I'd see him come home, sometimes with a group of loud, laughing friends who looked like they'd all just stepped out of a calendar photo shoot. They'd carry in cases of beer, and the smell of barbecue would drift up to my window a few hours later. Through the floor, I learned the rhythms of his life. The heavy thump of his work boots hitting the floor in the early morning. The muffled bass of his music in the evenings. The sound of his laughter, a low, rumbling thing that vibrated through the old wooden beams of the building. He was a constant, living presence just beneath my feet, and I found myself building a whole narrative around him. He was confident, popular, and, in my mind, completely, unshakably straight. He was a son I could only observe from a safe, planetary distance. He was entirely unattainable, which made the quiet, persistent crush I was developing on him feel harmless. It was a fantasy, nothing more. A little bit of warmth in my otherwise very orderly, very solitary life. The inciting incident, as they say in stories, wasn't some grand, dramatic affair. It began with a drip. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, and I was woken by the sound of a steady plink 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 coming from my bathroom. I stumbled out of bed, my mind still foggy with sleep, and found a small puddle forming around the base of the toilet. An annoyance, I thought. I threw a towel down and made a mental note to call the landlord in the morning. But the drip became a trickle, and the trickle became a steady stream. Within half an hour, the towel was soaked through and the puddle had become a shallow lake spreading across my tile floor. A wave of panic washed over me. I tried turning the valve behind the toilet, but the ancient metal was rusted shut. As I frantically searched for a wrench I knew I didn't own, I heard it, a frantic, heavy pounding on my front door. I opened it to find Caleb, looking wider and more imposing than ever in just a pair of gray sweatpants, his hair a mess from sleep. His face was a mask of concern. "Hey man," he said, his voice a low gravel. "You okay up here? It's raining in my kitchen." Mortification is a unique and terrible feeling. It's hot and cold all at once. My face flushed as I imagined water pouring onto his countertops, his floor. "Oh my God," I managed to say. "I am so sorry. The pipe behind my toilet, it burst." He peered past me into my apartment, saw the small sea I was presiding over, and his expression softened from alarm to something more practical. "Right," he said, already shifting into what I could only assume was his firefighter mode. "We need to shut off the main. Do you know where it is?" Of course I didn't. But he did. In minutes, he had found the main water valve in the building's musty basement and wrenched it shut. The gushing in my bathroom subsided to a final, pathetic gurgle. We stood in the quiet aftermath, the air thick with the smell of damp plaster and my own profound embarrassment. The floor was a disaster. My floor, and by extension, his ceiling. I am so unbelievably sorry, I said again, feeling my shoulders slump. I'll call the landlord first thing. I'll pay for any damage, of course. He just shook his head, running a hand through his already messy hair. Don't worry about it. Stuff happens in this old building. It's not your fault. He looked around at my soggy apartment, then back at me. I was probably a pathetic sight, standing there in my worn-out t-shirt and pajama pants, my feet bare on the cold, wet floor. Look, they're gonna have to tear up the floor in there to fix the pipe, and probably my ceiling too. The water's going to be off for a while. A few days, at least. My mind raced. A hotel. I'd have to find a hotel. The expense, the inconvenience, it all piled on top of the humiliation. As if reading my mind, Caleb made an offer that completely blindsided me. Hey, he said, his tone casual, as if he were offering me a cup of sugar. My spare room is just a storage closet for my gym stuff. It's got a bed. You should just stay with me until this is sorted out. I stared at him, sure I had misheard. What? Oh no, I couldn't. I can just get a motel or something. He gave a small, dismissive shrug. Why? It's no trouble, man. Seriously, it's just sitting there empty. Better than some roadside motel, right? He gave me a small, tired smile. It was the first time he had ever really smiled at me, and it did something strange to my insides. It was disarming. Come on, he said. Grab your laptop, some clothes. We'll deal with the rest in the morning. And just like that, because I was too tired, too overwhelmed, and too stunned by his kindness to argue, I agreed. I packed a small bag, my hands trembling slightly, my mind reeling. The man from my harmless daydreams, the unattainable sun, had just invited me into his orbit. A burst pipe had breached the walls of my carefully constructed, solitary world. Moving the few things I needed into Caleb's apartment felt surreal. His place was a reflection of him, or at least the version of him I thought I knew. It was neat, but lived in. There was a well-worn leather couch, a massive television, and a set of heavy-looking dumbbells in the corner. A faint, pleasant scent of cedar and something vaguely spicy hung in the air. It smelled like him. He showed me to the spare room. It was small, dominated by a simple bed with a plain blue comforter. He cleared a pile of workout clothes off a chair. Sorry about the mess, he said, though there was hardly any. Make yourself at home. Bathroom's just across the hall. Towels are in the closet. He paused at the door, turning back to me. Try and get some sleep. We'll figure out the landlord situation tomorrow. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of him moving around his own room, the soft click of a light switch, the creak of his mattress. I was intensely, overwhelmingly aware of his proximity. Just a thin wall separated us. It was both thrilling and terrifying. My harmless crush suddenly felt very, very real and dangerously close. The next few days unfolded in a strange domestic rhythm I never could have predicted. The landlord confirmed it would be at least a week before my apartment was livable again. So, I became Caleb's temporary roommate. I'd wake up in the morning to the smell of coffee already brewing. He was always up before me, a creature of habit from years of early shifts. The first morning, I found him in the kitchen, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. He pushed one across the counter to me without a word. Thanks, I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep. I'm not usually this human before 9, he chuckled. That low, rumbling sound that was so much more potent without a ceiling to muffle it. I get it. Most of my crew are basically zombies until the second cup. We fell into an easy pattern. I'd work on my laptop at his kitchen table while he was at the firehouse. He'd come home, exhausted and hungry, and I'd have dinner started. It was something I could do to repay his hospitality, and honestly, cooking for 2 was a welcome change from my usual solo meals. We'd eat together, sometimes talking about his day, the calls he'd been on, the strange and sometimes heartbreaking things he saw. He never complained. He just stated facts with a quiet, steady resolve. I started to see past the cliché firefighter I'd built up in my head. Yes, he was strong and capable, but he was also thoughtful and surprisingly observant. He noticed I liked my coffee black. He noticed I always had a true crime podcast playing quietly while I worked. He'd ask me about my projects, and even though I was sure he didn't understand the intricacies of JavaScript, he listened with genuine interest. The layers I had imagined around him began to peel away, revealing someone far more complex and interesting. The big revelation happened on the third day. I was home alone, and I needed to find an extension cord for my laptop. Caleb had told me to grab anything I needed from the spare room closet. As I rummaged behind a stack of old board games, my hand knocked over a large, leather-bound portfolio. It fell open on the floor, spilling its contents. They were drawings. Dozens of them. They were charcoal sketches, incredibly detailed and emotionally charged. There were sprawling cityscapes, capturing the lonely beauty of fire escapes against a dawn sky. There were portraits, too. Raw, unflinching sketches of faces, etched with exhaustion, fear, and sometimes a sliver of hope. I recognized the tired lines around the eyes of an old woman, the wide-eyed terror of a child. These were the people he encountered on his calls. I was so engrossed I didn't hear him come in. "Find what you were looking for?" His voice made me jump, and I scrambled to gather the scattered drawings, feeling like I'd been caught snooping. "I am so sorry," I stammered, my face burning. "I was looking for an extension cord and I knocked this over. I shouldn't have looked." He came over and knelt beside me, but he wasn't angry. He just looked embarrassed. He picked up one of the portraits, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the paper. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Nobody's ever really seen these before." "They're incredible, Caleb," I said, and I meant it. "You're a real artist." He let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. "Hardly. It's just a thing I do. Helps me get the images out of my head, you know? After a bad call. It's easier to put them on paper than to let them just live up here." He tapped his temple. "It's my way of processing, I guess." And in that moment, something shifted irrevocably. This was a side of him I never could have imagined. The strong, confident firefighter had this deep, hidden well of sensitivity and vulnerability. He wasn't just the sum of his muscles and his heroic job. He was an artist who used charcoal to make sense of the chaos he faced every day. My crush, which had been simmering on a low heat, suddenly cranked up to a boil. He was no longer just a fantasy. He was real and complex, and I was falling for him, hard. That evening, the new dynamic between us was palpable. The revelation of his art had opened a door, creating a new kind of intimacy. We decided to make pasta from scratch, an ambitious undertaking for his small kitchen. We worked side by side, dusting flour on the countertops, our arms occasionally brushing against each other. Each touch was like a small electric shock that I tried desperately to pretend I didn't feel. I was in charge of the sauce, and I reached into the spice cabinet for the oregano. At the exact same moment, Caleb reached for the basil. Our hands collided, fingers tangling together over the small glass jars. It was such a small, clumsy, accidental moment, but it felt monumental. The air crackled. The sounds of the kitchen, the bubbling of the sauce, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed to fade into the background. For a beat, neither of us moved. My skin tingled where his hand touched mine. I looked up at him, and his gaze was fixed on our joined hands. His expression was unreadable, a flicker of something I couldn't name in his eyes. Then, as quickly as it happened, it was over. He pulled his hand back, his knuckles bumping against the cabinet door. "Sorry," he mumbled, clearing his throat and grabbing the basil. He turned away, busying himself with chopping vegetables, but I saw the faint flush on the back of his neck. My heart was hammering against my ribs. It wasn't just me, was it? He felt it too. The hope that flared up in my chest was so bright it was almost painful. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. This was no longer a one-sided crush admired from a distance. We were here, together, covered in flour, with a current of unspoken energy flowing between us. And I had no idea what to do next. The days that followed were a delicate dance. The plumbing repairs in my apartment were, of course, taking longer than expected. Issues with the subflooring, the landlord had said vaguely over the phone. So my temporary stay with Caleb extended into a second week. After the moment in the kitchen, a new awareness hummed between us, a kind of charged caution. We were careful not to stand too close, not to let our hands brush. The easy camaraderie had been replaced by a quiet, simmering tension. It was both agonizing and wonderful. Every small interaction was loaded with meaning that I would dissect for hours later, alone in the spare room. Did he hold my gaze for a second too long this morning? Did his voice sound softer when he said goodnight? My mind was a relentless loop of analysis, a frantic search for clues. Hope and fear were wrestling for control of my heart. Hope told me that the spark I felt was real, that it was shared. Fear whispered that I was imagining it all, that I was projecting my own feelings onto his simple acts of kindness. One night, the storm inside my head found its match in the world outside. A fierce thunderstorm rolled in, rattling the old windows of the building and casting flickering shadows across the walls. I've always been a restless sleeper, prone to nightmares, a lovely parting gift from a bad car accident a few years prior. The sound of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain must have triggered something, because I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was tangled in my sheets, my t-shirt soaked in a cold sweat. In the disorienting darkness of the unfamiliar room, the remnants of the dream clung to me, the screech of tires, the shattering of glass. I sat up, trying to catch my breath, trying to anchor myself in the present, but the panic was a physical thing, a tight band around my chest. I must have made a sound, a choked sob or a gasp, because a moment later, my door creaked open. Miles. Caleb's voice was a low whisper in the dark, barely audible over the storm. A sliver of light from the hallway silhouetted his broad frame. "You okay?" I couldn't find my voice. I just shook my head, wrapping my arms around my knees. He didn't turn on the light. He just came in and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping with his weight. The proximity of him was immediately calming, a solid, warm presence in the chaotic aftermath of my nightmare. "Bad dream?" he asked softly. I just nodded, still unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He didn't push. He didn't ask what it was about. He just sat there with me in the dark, a silent guardian against the shadows. We sat like that for minutes, the only sounds the storm outside and my own ragged breathing, which was slowly, finally, starting to even out. "I'm sorry I woke you," I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. "Don't be," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm a light sleeper anyway." He shifted, and his knee brushed against my leg. The contact was brief, but it sent a tremor through me. I was still shivering, a lingering effect of the adrenaline. He must have noticed, because he reached out and pulled the comforter up, tucking it around my shoulders. His hand lingered there, a warm, heavy weight that felt incredibly grounding. In that moment, stripped bare by fear and exhaustion, all my carefully constructed defenses crumbled. All the second-guessing, all the anxiety, it all just fell away. I was acting on pure, unadulterated instinct. I leaned sideways, resting my head against his solid chest. I felt his entire body go still. My own heart stopped for a second. I had crossed a line, a massive, uncrossable line. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for him to pull away, to tell me to get a grip, to create the distance that I had just so recklessly destroyed. But he didn't. After a long, silent moment where I was sure I had ruined everything, he moved. But he didn't pull away. Instead, his arm came around me, pulling me closer. His hand started rubbing slow, soothing circles on my back. He rested his chin on the top of my head, and I could feel the low rumble in his chest as he took a deep breath. "You're okay," he murmured into my hair. "You're safe." And I was. I felt safer in that moment than I had in years. I let out a shaky breath and melted against him, the terror of the nightmare finally receding, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of comfort. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear and the solid warmth of his arm around me were the most comforting things I had ever known. I don't know when I drifted off, but I fell asleep right there, curled up against him, lulled by the sound of the storm and the steady presence of the man holding me. It was the deepest, most peaceful sleep I'd had in a very long time. Waking up the next morning was one of the most disorienting experiences of my life. For a blissful, fleeting moment, I was just warm and comfortable. Then memory came rushing back in a tidal wave of mortification. I was in the spare room bed, alone. Sunlight was streaming through the window. But the memory of leaning against Caleb, of his arm around me, was so vivid it felt like a brand on my skin. Had I dreamed it? But then I saw it. The blue comforter was tucked neatly around me, and on the bedside table was a glass of water that hadn't been there before. He had stayed with me. He had tucked me in. My stomach twisted itself into a complicated knot of hope and dread. The atmosphere in the apartment that morning was thick enough to cut with a knife. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave the bedroom, I found Caleb in the kitchen, staring intently into his coffee mug as if it held the secrets of the universe. He looked up when I came in, and his eyes darted away almost immediately. "Morning," he mumbled, not meeting my gaze. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. The air was buzzing with everything that we weren't saying. The comfortable silence we had once shared was gone, replaced by this gaping, awkward void. We were like two strangers forced to share a space, carefully maneuvering around each other, terrified of making contact. He poured me a coffee and set it on the counter, making sure our fingers didn't touch. I felt sick with anxiety. I had done this. My moment of weakness, my desperate need for comfort, had shattered the fragile peace between us. I had taken his kindness and twisted it into something else, something he clearly wasn't comfortable with. The way he was avoiding my eyes confirmed my worst fears. He was regretting his kindness. He pitied me, and now he was stuck with this emotionally fragile mess in his spare room. I spent the rest of the day holed up in my room, my laptop open but the screen a blur. I couldn't focus on work. My mind was a relentless replay of the night before. I replayed the feel of his hand on my back, the sound of his voice in my ear. I dissected every tiny detail, searching for meaning. Was it just a compassionate gesture, the kind of thing a decent person does for someone who's had a nightmare? Or was it something more? Had I felt a hesitation in his touch? A tightening of his arm that was more than just comforting? The hope was a dangerous, seductive poison. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, he felt something too. That my desperate lean into him wasn't a violation, but an invitation he had accepted. But then the fear would roar back, louder and more convincing. It told me I was a fool, that I was seeing what I wanted to see. That Caleb was a kind, straight man who had been put in an awkward position and was now too polite to kick me out. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. The tension was unbearable. I couldn't stay here, not like this. I couldn't keep looking at him, knowing I had made things so strange between us. It was better to retreat, to go back to my safe, solitary world where the only person I could disappoint was myself. I made a decision. I would pack my things and go to a hotel. It didn't matter what the landlord said. I had to get out. I had to escape the crushing weight of this uncertainty. I threw my few belongings into my duffel bag, my movements jerky and rushed. My heart felt like a lead weight in my chest. I was running away. I was choosing the familiar ache of loneliness over the terrifying possibility of rejection. With my bag packed and my resolve hardening, I took a deep breath and walked out of the room to find Caleb. It was time to end this. I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter in the exact same spot where he'd been that morning. He was staring out the window, his shoulders tense. He heard my footsteps and turned, his eyes finally meeting mine. His expression was guarded, unreadable. "Caleb," I started, my voice sounding weaker than I wanted. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. But I'm going to go. I'll find a hotel for the last few days." A flicker of something, surprise, disappointment, crossed his face before he masked it. "You don't have to do that, Miles. The room's no trouble." "No, I know, but I think it's for the best," I said, forcing a small, brittle smile. "I've imposed on you long enough. And I need to apologize for last night. I was out of line, and I made you uncomfortable, and I'm really sorry." He pushed himself off the counter, taking a step toward me. His face was serious, his jaw tight. "Stop," he said, his voice low but firm. "Just stop. You have nothing to apologize for. And you didn't make me uncomfortable." My brows furrowed in confusion. "But we've been so awkward all day." He let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. He looked like he'd been wrestling with himself all day, too. "Yeah," he admitted. "We have. But it's not because of you. It's because of me." He took another step, closing some of the distance between us. The air grew thick again, but this time it wasn't awkwardness. It was something else. Anticipation. "Look," he began, struggling to find the words. He looked down at his hands, then back up at me, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that made my breath catch. For a long time, my whole life, really, I've told myself I'm not. I'm not that kind of man. My heart plummeted. I knew exactly what he meant. This was it. The gentle rejection. He was letting me down easy, telling me he was straight, that he couldn't be what I so desperately wanted him to be. I braced myself for the impact, my throat tightening. The kind of man who feels. This, he gestured vaguely between us, his voice strained. "For another guy." I nodded, my eyes stinging. I tried to speak, to tell him it was okay, that I understood, but the words wouldn't come. But he wasn't finished. He took another deliberate step forward, until he was standing directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His gaze was intense, unwavering. "I'm not that kind of man," he repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laden with a meaning that was the complete opposite of rejection. "But when I was holding you last night, when you fell asleep on my chest, I realized I wanted to be. God, I wanted to be that man for you." My mind short-circuited. I couldn't process the words. I could only stare at him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He saw the shock and confusion on my face, and a small, almost pained smile touched his lips. And then his hands were on my waist. They were warm and firm, and his touch sent a jolt of electricity through my entire body. He gently, but with an undeniable purpose, guided me backward until my legs hit the edge of the kitchen island. I braced myself against it, my hands flat on the cool granite. He was standing between my legs, his body caging me in, his face just inches from mine. He searched my eyes, a silent, profound question hanging in the space between us. He was giving me an out. He was waiting for a sign. All I could manage was a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all he needed. He closed the final inch of distance between us, and his lips met mine. The first touch was hesitant, questioning. It was soft and gentle, a stark contrast to the strength in the hands that were still gripping my waist. I responded instantly, a wave of relief and disbelief and pure, unadulterated joy washing over me. I leaned into him, my hands coming up to cup his jaw, and the kiss deepened. It transformed from a question into an answer. It was confident and sure, and filled with all the unspoken tension that had been building between us for days. It tasted of coffee and regret and a breathtaking, terrifying hope. In that moment, pressed against his kitchen island, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The weeks that followed the kiss were a blur of discovery. The awkwardness that had plagued us vanished, replaced by a tentative, exciting exploration of what we were to each other. Once the truth was out in the open, it was like a dam had broken. Caleb talked for hours, telling me about the feelings he'd been suppressing for years, the confusion and the fear, and the undeniable pull he'd felt toward me since the day I'd moved in upstairs. He admitted he'd known about my quiet observation of him, and had even found it endearing. My apartment was finally repaired, but I spent very little time there. Most nights, I was at Caleb's, or he was at mine. We went on our first official date to a small Italian restaurant downtown. We held hands under the table, and it felt both shockingly new and completely natural. We learned the small details about each other that you only discover in the comfortable intimacy of a relationship. He hated mushrooms. I couldn't sleep without a fan on for white noise. He loved terrible action movies from the 90s. I had a weakness for documentaries about obscure historical events. We were piecing together the puzzle of each other, and every new piece that clicked into place made the picture clearer, brighter. The cautious, lonely web developer and the sensitive, artistic firefighter. We were an unlikely pair, but somehow, we just fit. The quiet spaces in my life were suddenly filled with his easy laughter, and I saw a lightness in him that I knew his friends and colleagues rarely got to see. We were good for each other. A couple of months later, I was at his place on a lazy Sunday afternoon. He was at the firehouse for a 24-hour shift, and I was enjoying the quiet, the scent of him that lingered on his pillows. I noticed his sketchbook lying on the coffee table. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the worn leather cover. I flipped through the pages, past the haunting portraits and the lonely cityscapes, until I found a new section at the back. They were sketches of me. There I was, concentrating on my laptop at his kitchen table, a small smile on my face. There I was, laughing at one of his bad jokes, my head thrown back. And then I turned a page, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a drawing of me, asleep. My head was resting on his chest, my face peaceful, vulnerable. He had captured the image from the night of the storm, the night everything changed. He had drawn it from memory, every detail perfect, from the way my hair was falling across my forehead to the gentle curve of my shoulder. I was still looking at it when I heard the key in the door. Caleb came in, looking tired from his shift, but his face broke into a wide smile when he saw me on the couch. He dropped his bag and came over, leaning down to kiss me. He saw what I was looking at. "Oh," he said, a faint blush rising on his cheeks. He came around the couch and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder and looking down at the drawing with me. I drew that the next day. It's beautiful, I whispered, my finger tracing the charcoal lines of my own sleeping form. That's the night, he said quietly, his voice a low rumble against my ear. That's the night I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. When you trusted me like that, when you just leaned on me. Everything I had been telling myself for years just fell apart. It was terrifying, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I leaned back into his embrace, my heart full to the point of aching. It's strange how life works. You build walls around your heart for protection. You create routines to keep yourself safe from the unpredictable chaos of the world. You think you're in control. And then a rusty pipe bursts in the middle of the night, and the floodwaters wash away all your defenses, leaving you vulnerable and exposed. But sometimes, that's exactly what needs to happen. Sometimes the foundations have to crack for the light to get in. And my God, his light was brighter than I ever could have imagined.